Okay, welcome to session 7 of Old Testament survey. This is our 5th session in the book of Genesis, and we're just getting underway. There are 4 great events that define the first half of Genesis, and we're just going to get into one of the most important today. But the creation, then the fall of man, followed by the flood, followed by the division of the nations into their linguistic groups. So the creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel, division of languages. And those 4 events are taught to us in Genesis as the foundational events of biblical history. These things actually happen, and they have profound theological significance. In order for us to understand who God is, who man is, what sin is, and what salvation is about, we have to understand these components of biblical history. So this is actually a very important section of the Bible. It's not just for children. We should definitely teach this to children, but remember that there's a whole lot more going on. And what I'll be covering today is going to take you a bit beyond what we typically give to children. The story of Noah and the ark and all of the animals makes for cute puppet shows and stuffed animals, and it's a great story for children. But the story that the Bible tells is actually terrifying. There's something genuinely catastrophic, a truly enormous event that destroyed the entire planet, the entire surface of the earth. And today I'm going to walk you through some of that to see if you can catch some of the awe, some of the, and to use the term in its original sense, the awfulness of the biblical flood. Modern critics have regularly and often attacked the reality of the creation, of the fall, of the flood, and of the Tower of Babel. These 4 great central events of the biblical story are necessary foundations for so much else that we believe. And because of that, the critics have always attacked them. And we find it particularly in the last 200 years, the post-Enlightenment era of biblical studies. More and more commentators and theologians and historians of various stripes have felt it necessary to inform the Christian world that we're completely wrong about our beliefs in the creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. What I would like us to consider today is some of the scientific evidence. Now, by scientific evidence, I mean the hard evidence that we can find out in the rocks. If you study geology, it's virtually impossible to escape hard evidence for the creation and for the flood. Those things are so obvious. The fall, a little harder to find in the archaeological record, although I can point to it, I can show you. And the same with the Tower of Babel. That's a little harder to point to in the archaeological record, but I can show you languages I can explain how languages relate to each other. And so for each of these central stories of biblical history, there is hard scientific evidence. Now, I'm not going to say proof. One, I don't believe the Bible requires proof. I believe if God said it, it's true, and I'm good with that. By evidence, I mean hard fragments of fact open to anybody's investigation, which will be interpreted according to the presuppositions of the person looking at the evidence. And so the non-Christian looking at the evidence of geology, for example, will see billions of years and evolution and the wonders of Mother Earth and so on. The Christian, with the knowledge of God, with a relationship to Christ, should have no problem at all with a literal creation, a literal fall, a literal flood, and a literal Tower of Babel. The evidence is there, but we don't begin with the evidence. We begin with the Word of God. That gives us our presuppositions. And with those ideas walking in, the evidence begins to make perfectly good sense. It all holds together in a remarkable way. And I've got an aunt who wants to be just walking across my Bible. That was a bad move for him. Okay, let's get into Genesis 6 again. I'm going to be sharing the screen. Let's see if I've got Genesis 6. Now I have to do the presenter view. Whoops, there we go. Just like that. So last time we got into this this first section of Genesis. We looked at the first 8 verses of Genesis. I'm going to go back through that section one more time because I went rather rapidly at the end last time. I wanted to get us to verse 8. Verse 8 is a key verse for understanding what's going on. There are some parts of this passage that are difficult. Sometimes difficulties are there because of our ignorance. Sometimes difficulties are there because the language is inherently difficult. Sometimes difficulties are there, as in this case, because we're not really told very much. And so we have to read between the lines. It's like this picture in the background is a fragmentary copy of a Babylonian story called the Gilgamesh epic. And one of the big problems with the Gilgamesh epic is all we have is fragments, chunks of clay tablet with the writing there, but lots of big gaps. Well, Genesis 6 leaves out some things that we think we'd like to have. Everything God wants us to have is, in fact, here. We're not missing anything that God thinks we need. But there's some things I would love to know, like who were those sons of God? I think that was angels. Some people think that was the offspring of Seth. I think the angel hypothesis solves more problems than the Sethite hypothesis and causes fewer problems of its own. But neither answer is absolute. We don't know. We're told that at this time, in verse 5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's a very, very strong statement. Every thing going on, every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This is God looking at the whole human race, and by this time, this amounts to millions of people. We're talking about at least a couple of thousand years by the time we get to Noah. There's certainly millions of people on the planet. Prior to the flood, there was one great big continent, we think, that would split up after the flood. But that one big continent was perhaps a third of the Earth's surface, just as it is today. And people had scattered all over. They were everywhere. The decision to destroy the Earth and all of mankind is based on the observation that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So this is a universal sin problem that results in a universal judgment. The primary argument for a universal flood is not from the geology, although I can give you that argument. I will make that argument here in a set of slides we'll see in a moment. I can show you that there are flood sediments all over the Earth. So the argument for a universal flood is not difficult from geology, but that's not the primary argument. The primary argument is biblical. God's observation was that sin had extended to every part of every man, and every human being deserved to be punished for sin. So there's a universality, a global extension of the wrath of God. So every intention of thoughts of his heart only evil continually. The Lord regretted that he had made man, and it grieved him that he had made man. The grief there is a very strong word. Generally speaking, when God experiences grief, that's not a good thing for the one who has given God the grief. And in this case, it's a very bad thing. Thank you. So God says, I'll blot out man whom I've created, that is all of mankind, from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heaven, for I am sorry that I've made them. So the intention that God states in verse 7 is one of a destructive wrath on the entire planet. Mankind, the animals, the birds, and even the fish. So what we would expect in the geologic record would be some evidence of widespread death. This is why I say this is a story for grown-ups. This is not a children's story. The flood is a story of massive death, widespread death, and a genuinely terrible thing. Noah, on the other hand, in verse 8, is said to have found favor in the eyes of the Lord. I want you to see a Venn diagram. Those of us who draw things on whiteboards often use Venn diagrams. So here's a circle, and this is supposed to be a circle of universality. And what is the circle labeled? But wrath, the wrath of God. The wrath of God is described in Genesis 6 as being universal. Everyone and everything will experience this judgment of God, this angry response of God to the universal problem of sin. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. The word favor is the little Hebrew word chen, which we sometimes translate grace. It should better be translated grace, but we rarely translate it grace. We almost always translate it favor. And in this verse particularly, I believe it ought to be translated grace. They mean the same things. They both mean chen, with the Hebrew word, which is God's provision of resources to one who could never provide those resources for himself. So the grace of God is by definition given freely by a sovereign provider to one who is helpless. So what we're discovering here is that Noah was included among those in verse 5, whose every intention, whose every thought was evil. The sin extended to Noah and his sons. The grace of God can be thought of as an exception to the wrath of God. So if the wrath of God is universal, God's grace applies to a chosen remnant, a few. There were 8 people plus the animals who survived the flood. That's the biblical story. People who try to argue that the biblical flood had to have been local, it had to have been a Mesopotamian river flood or a Black Sea flood or some other kind of local flood, are missing the point. The point of the story and the point of the historical event is a universal wrath, which demands that the whole world be involved, and the very particular grace. This develops the pattern for all of the rest of biblical history. So we're going to discover that in the book of Romans, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. God has chosen to save some and has left the others to their fate. The wrath of God is universal, but the grace of God is selective. And it is very important to understand that the grace of God is not built on good works or good theology or a good haircut or whatever else we might think people are saved for. God doesn't save us because we're good. God didn't save Noah because he was good. God didn't even save Noah because he looked forward into time and saw that Noah would be good. God saved Noah because God is good. An extremely important concept, and yet one that is very, very easy to overlook. Now, as part of the argument for that, we're going to go on to verse 9. This is 6:9. These are the generations of Noah. There's that passage again. Ela Toledot. These are the generations. And again, this closes out one document and begins another document. So what we have here can sometimes be called the Book of Noah. So these are the generations of Noah, or here's what became of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Okay, I want us to think about that for just a minute. I'd have you raise hands. If we were in a classroom full of students, I'd have you raise hands when you figured this out. How many of you think that verse 8 comes before verse 9? Does anybody think that 8 comes before 9? Okay, I see those hands. That's good. You're getting it. So the grace of God comes before Noah's righteousness. Grace is in fact the key to righteousness. Now, why was Noah a righteous man? Because by God's grace, Noah walked with God. You and I are righteous by the grace of God. Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9. For by grace you are saved, by faith, and even that not of yourselves. It, the salvation, including the grace and the faith, is the gift of God. By grace you are saved by faith, and that not of yourselves, lest any man should boast. Okay. So what we're seeing here is this universal idea. So there's a mingling here of the themes of judgment and of grace. In the midst of grace, or in the midst of wrath and judgment, God's people, these 8 who have been saved by grace, are going to be taken out. But before that happens, we're told the story of the 100-year construction project. What a tremendous story! Can you visualize Noah and his boys working on this project for 100 years? And yet that's exactly what the Bible tells us. And during all of that time, he was surrounded by his neighbors. And we're not sure who all those people were, but we know that none of them got onto the ark. And during that time, Noah is called over in the book of Hebrews a preacher of righteousness. Noah was trying to introduce his neighbors to the reason for the construction of an ark. He says, I'm building this big boat because there's going to be a terrible flood, and this will be our way out of it. And you're welcome to join us when the time comes. Noah was the first real evangelist. He had access to the escape route from the wrath of God. And during 100 years, he was willing to share that in spite of the fact that no one around him responded. God's people from this time on are uniformly called to be the agents of grace in the midst of the wrath of God. When bad things are happening, God's people are called to live faithfully and to offer to anyone who will listen the free grace of God. That's our job. We're normally not called to be the agents of wrath. And so Noah didn't destroy anyone. He was the agent of salvation in the midst of a catastrophic event. Okay, as we walk into this, we're going to begin seeing a whole bunch of details. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who are going to be important later on. And the earth was corrupt in God's sight, verse 11. Earth was filled with violence. God saw that the earth was corrupt and all flesh had corrupted their way. And God said to Noah, I've determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark from gopher wood. Now, we actually don't know what gopher wood here is. The Bible doesn't really tell us. It may be something like oak, which is sometimes called a terebinth, but it may not have been. We actually don't know. It was some wood that was good for building boats. So it was strong, it was dense, it could be machined with hand tools. Oak would fit, so would red fir, but we don't really know what this is. They said, make yourself an ark. The word ark is a word that means a box, literally. Like later on, we're going to hear about the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark is not a boat. The Ark is a box, actually. The Ark of the Covenant is just a box to hold the stone tablets of the giving of the law, the Ten Commandments, and some other objects, a bit of manna, Aaron's rod, that goes in the box, and then the lid that goes on top of the box is often called the mercy seat. We'll talk about that later. The Ark for Noah is also a big container. It's a box-like ship that most likely was not designed to go quickly through the water. It was more like a barge. Think of it as having probably curves to it, because curves are stronger than straight lines. I believe that it was relatively narrower at the bow and stern, the front and back of the barge, than it was in the middle, and that the keel had a curve to it, but it probably didn't look like the cute cartoon images of Noah's Ark. The shape of this boat is actually quite large. It was to be 300 cubits long, which is about 150 meters, which is a pretty good sized boat. It's not gigantic. Modern warships and bulk carriers carry oil or copper ore or that sort of thing. Can get much longer than that. There are warships that are easily 400 meters long. So it's not the biggest boat that could ever be built, but it is big. It is definitely very large. The breadth is 50 cubits, which is about 25 meters, and the height is 30 cubits, about 15 meters. Uh, so any way you look at it, this is a fairly good sized ship. The dimensions of the Ark would make it very stable. Naval architects use these same proportions when designing an aircraft carrier or a Coast Guard cutter or a fishing boat. You use roughly the same proportions and change the proportions depending on what kind of stability you really have to have. So a Coast Guard cutter is a little longer and narrower to make it faster, but it also makes it less stable. And a coal barge is a little wider and a little flatter because you don't really need a lot of interior space. And so they change them around, but the proportions would make for a very stable ride in rough seas, which is what the Ark needed to provide. It had to somehow or another survive for about a year in very rough weather, very stormy weather. So we see the description there, and the description is fairly detailed. It's to have a roof and finish it to a cubit above. That is, there's to be about half a meter worth of clerestory windows around the edge of the roof, probably with a bit of a deck on the outside of that. Set a door in the side of the Ark, and the door would only have to be big enough for the largest of the animals. It wouldn't have to be one of these gigantic clamshell doors that you see in tank landing craft. It had to be big enough to get elephants in, but no bigger than that. The giraffe can bend his neck if he needs to. So make a roof, set a door on the side, make it with a lower, second, and third deck. So a three-decker. The lower deck, the what would be the bilge area, would be given over to very large animals. So it would have a fairly high overhead. The second deck would be given over to all of the other animals that didn't necessarily fit into the large animal style. And the upper deck would be given over to the people, but there's only 8 of them, and so they would have some space somewhere on that deck. And then other animals that were considered domestic or otherwise fragile perhaps would live up there. Those who are wondering, the animals are divided up by their kinds. The Hebrew word that we translate kinds is fairly vague, and it doesn't coincide with our modern scientific notion of a species. The kind defined differences between animals and insects and stuff such that they couldn't breed with one another. So today it's actually possible for a horse and is it a horse and a mule that can breed together, or not? You know, so a horse could breed with a zebra, and I don't know what kind of baby horses they would have, but you know, that could happen because they're in the same general family. The biblical word kind is somewhat general, so there was probably one kind of horse, one boy horse and one girl horse, and there they were. And from those original horses, all of the various different kinds of horses, the sorts of horses that we have today, have developed. But all of those horses could mate, and that is the point of the kind. But the monkey and the mosquito could never get along together. They would never be able to make a home. The bird may love a fish, but where would they live? You know, the old the Jewish proverb. Uh, that's Fiddler on the Roof for those of you who are wondering. So they're very different kinds. Um, and God says in verse 17, "Behold, I will bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy all flesh beneath all of the heavens. Everything that is on earth shall die." Verse 18, "But I will establish my covenant with you. And you shall come into the ark, you and your sons, your wife, your sons' wives with you. Every living thing, all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark. They shall be male and female of the birds according to their kinds, the animals according to their kinds, every creeping thing on the ground according to his kind. Also take every sort of food that is eaten and store it, and it shall serve as food for you and for them." And Noah did all of this just as God had commanded him. So there we have the beginning of the story. And in chapter 7, the story continues. The details of the flood. The Lord said to Noah, "Get into the ark, you and all your household. I've seen that you're righteous. Take 7 pairs of clean animals," and so on. And he says in verse 4, "For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the earth." Noah did as he was commanded. Now Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came upon the earth. That's an important chronological statement. In chapter 5, we see that Noah was 500 years old when he began the construction of the ark. And here we see that 100 years have passed by. We're going to see then some very specific chronological statements that take us through the flood itself. So the description is given. In the 600th day of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that very day, the fountains of the great deep burst forth, the windows of the heavens were opened, and the rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. So the first thing that happens, the cataclysm begins with these two great events, the breaking up of the fountains of the deep and the opening of the windows of heaven. And the result was rain that fell for 40 days. There's a lot of this that we don't completely understand. The imagery is somewhat ambiguous, but what do we mean by the fountains of the deep? I'm convinced that the fountains of the deep should best be understood as the breaking up of the Earth's crust and the production of volcanic activity. So lava flows on the Earth, volcanoes, uh, uh, the beginnings of what will be continental drift. The continents, we can see by looking at a map of the world, the continents have drifted gradually apart. Scientists speak of an original single continent called Pangaea, and their time frames are all messed up, but it doesn't really matter. They've seen the same evidence, and it appears that the continents of the world have actually drifted apart from a single beginning, and the drifting is associated with the volcanic activity in those continents. So the Pacific Ocean, which is drifting together, has continents that are drifting toward one another with a front side of each of the continents that is ringed with fire. And so we call this the Pacific Ring of Fire. The Philippines is full of volcanoes because that's an eastward moving plate that contains the Philippines, and much of the Western Pacific is moving toward the east. The Eastern Pacific, with the United States and the western part of South America, is moving toward the west. And we can see in the middle of the Pacific Ocean a subduction zone where the Earth's crust is forming trenches and going down. In the Atlantic Ocean, the Earth's crust seems to be still spreading apart. And there's a trench in the middle where new formations are coming up and out. We can see that movement still going on today. So this is not fringe science. The scientists have known this for quite some time. The fountains of the great deep are the bubbling up of molten lava out of the center of the earth. This in turn creates a fracturing of the earth's crust, a movement of the earth's crust. This is going to produce uplift in some places and subduction, subsistence in other places, tremendous amounts of erosion, the creation of rivers, the creation of coastlines, tremendous amounts of stuff is going to go on here. Among other things, the volcanoes coming up in the ocean are going to create a tremendous amount of steam. And the steam produces clouds. Now, we also think that prior to the flood, many scientists think that there was a kind of a canopy, a vapor canopy, a cloud canopy over the upper atmosphere. And as this event unfolds, that canopy, for reasons that are explained in a variety of different ways that I'm not going to bother you with right now, began to come apart, and all of that that mist, that clouds, the vapor began raining down on the surface of the earth. So the movement of lava and the movement of water out of the sky is causing 40 days when the rain comes down and the water is rising. So 40 days of water. And the rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and nights. On the very same day, Noah and his sons, along with every beast, went into the ark, and all of them were that the Lord God had commanded, and the Lord shut him in. Interesting, the lock is on the outside. The flood continued 40 days. That is, it increased. The waters increased and bore the ark up, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly. The ark floated on the face of the waters. The waters prevailed mightily on the earth, so that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. By the way, the high mountains need not have been all that high, just relatively high compared to the flat land. I think most of the earth prior to the flood was probably relatively flat. This is before the volcanoes began erupting and before the continental drift started creating mountains. So there were no high mountains. The Himalayas, for instance, in Central Asia, 27,000 feet. What is that? Not quite 9,000 meters. Those are really, really high. And people have said, that's an awful lot of water. Where would you put it all? I don't believe those were covered. When we go to the Himalayas, when you go to places like Nepal and Tibet and look at the geology, you'll find that that's all sedimentary rock. You'll find marine fossils high up on Mount Everest. The same thing is true in the Alps. The Alps are much closer for you there in Italy. And I recommend go up to some of the passes in the Alps, and just get out and walk around and look at the rocks. And what you find there is rocks like limestone and shale. I don't recall a lot of sandstone up there, but when you walk around up there, you're going to find fossils in those rocks. Those are marine sedimentary rocks. The sediments were laid down relatively flat, and then the earth was bent up, and that's how those mountains were formed. So the high mountains perhaps were a few hundred feet. It may have been somewhat more than that, but they were not hundreds of thousands of feet. They were a few thousands of feet. The layers of sediment in the mountainous portions of the earth can be as much as 2 miles thick. That's about 10,000 feet, about 3,300 meters. So that would be all the higher that it really need to be, but there's the argument. So the high mountains are covered, not necessarily Mount Everest, which didn't exist yet. And the waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep, which would be deep enough for the ark to pass over the surface everywhere. And all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds and livestock and beasts and swarming things, and all mankind. So why did God command Noah to build an ark? Well, the reason for that is that he was intending a worldwide catastrophe. If the flood had been local, Noah would have been commanded to build a wagon. And we'd be telling stories about Noah's wagon and his migration from the flatlands up to the hill country. But that's not what happened. The land was all relatively flat, and when the flood came, it was covered deeply enough that there was no place to run. The animals could have walked away from a local flood, but we're told that there was none that escaped. No animals, no humans. Now, some fish would survive, and probably some birds would survive, but all men and all mammals died in this, and most every other kind of creature. So Noah built an ark instead of a wagon. We know that God's anger, his wrath, was directed against the whole human race. The description of this thing is worldwide. It's difficult to miss those details. We see three stages in the flood. There is a rising water stage that goes for 40 days. Then there's about 150 days where the water prevails. One of the words that is used here as the water is prevailing for 150 days, the word means to slosh. Because of the way the earth rotates on its axis, and because of the location of the sun and the moon and the gravitational forces that are involved, currents form in the ocean. Where there is a continent to get in the way, those currents tend to flow around continents. If the whole Earth was covered with a relatively similar depth of water, those currents would begin sloshing. They would move very rapidly, ripping up fragments of rock and everything else, fragments of debris, fragments of dead things, and would slosh those around. And so there would be a sloshing in one direction, only to change direction and move in a different direction, a movement back and forth. This would produce different colors and forms of sedimentary rock. What we should expect from this sloshing period of the flood is layers of sedimentary rock. In that sedimentary rock, we should expect to find the evidence of death. There should be fossils. A fossil is not evidence of life so much as it is evidence of death, and particularly violent death. I know that's a kind of a shocking thing to think about, but that's really what happens here. The earth was utterly destroyed. Men and birds and fish and animals of every kind and insects and lizards and snakes and everything died. Dinosaurs, I believe there were dinosaurs on the earth. We find their skeletons today. Great big lizards that lived a long time. I have no doubt that they were there. All of these living things, together with all of the plants, trees and grass and everything else that lived on the surface of the earth, floated around for a while and was eventually buried in layers of sedimentary rock. Some of those fossils turned into oil, some turned into coal, and some of those fossils are still available for us to find today. When you look at sedimentary rock anywhere in the world that you can access on the surface, you'll normally find fossils. Sometimes they're microscopic and sometimes they're big enough to actually see. There's a place here in our neighborhood where we can go find fossils in a stream bed. And there are fossil leaves, and occasionally we find a fossil insect. No big animals, but other things. In the Grand Canyon, one of the most important things that we notice is layer after layer after layer of sedimentary rock, 2 miles deep sedimentary rock layers, all of it filled with fossils. And the fossils show us where all of the dead things are buried. They don't tell us either when or where the animals lived. The fossils show us where the animals were buried after they died. And we'll talk about that as we get into it. So what do we expect geologically as the water comes up? It sloshes back and forth, then it came back down again. As the waters came down, what was really going on, the continents were spreading, mountains were coming up, and the water was draining off. We would expect to find mountains formed, and we would expect for river valleys to be rapidly eroded. The stone had only been in place, the sedimentary rock of the surface had only been in place for a few months. As it is lifted up, the water rapidly eroded it away, forming rivers, canyons, coastal plains, undersea canyons, which is a whole different thing, and all kinds of interesting stuff. Now, the volcanoes continued to erupt during and after the flood, causing smoke and vapor to go up into the upper atmosphere. This would have given us a period, perhaps as long as 100 years, of global cooling. This led to the first of the ice ages. So we find in many parts of the Earth's surface that the ice covered both the northern and southern poles to an area as far south as here in Idaho, where we live. We can find the evidence of the glaciers here. In Europe, the ice came as far south as Italy. You'll find that northern valley where Como is located is heavily glaciated. The Philippines didn't have ice. I don't think it has ice today, but anyway. And you definitely don't want to order ice at McDonald's. I know that myself. But all of this, the glaciers, the volcano, the mountain building, the presence of oil and all of the fossils, the sedimentary rocks, is exactly what we find. And it's exactly what we would expect from a worldwide flood. From there, I want to show you some pictures. I'm going to have to make this share stop, and I'm going to start another share. This is, let me see if I can get it to come up. I'm going to kill that one, and I'm going to go over here, see if I can make it come up. Why is that not coming up? Okay, I need to kill this. I'm going to kill that one. You know, I hate it when this stuff doesn't work the way I want it to. Yes, I love it when something works once and you can never get it to work again. There we go. Bingo. Okay, this is a presentation on what I call young Earth creationism. This is the idea that the Bible is accurate when it speaks of a relatively young Earth. And I'm going to illustrate this with a bunch of pictures out of the Grand Canyon. I went on this trip 7 years ago. I believe it was 7 years ago. Might have been 6 years ago. Anyways, a while ago. Back when I was young enough to survive a trip like this, took 7 days on the Colorado River through 150 miles of the 500-mile long Grand Canyon in the western United States. It covers several states, including Arizona, Nevada, and Arizona. We flew into Las Vegas, got on a bus to go to our put-in spot, and then spent 7 days going only about halfway down the navigable part of the Grand Canyon, and then took a helicopter back out again. The Grand Canyon is an ideal place to look at the history of the Earth. Now, why do we even bother? Let me talk about this for just a bit. The problem, the reason that we study things like the Grand Canyon is, one, the Bible is clear. It actually is. Anybody who's reading the Bible with an open mind will understand about creation and about the flood. There's nothing symbolic or allegorical or figurative or difficult in this passage. So the Bible is actually quite clear, and the Bible is actually quite clear about the age of the earth, a relatively few thousands of years. It's not, that isn't difficult. Since the 18th century, a period of time that we call the Enlightenment, uh, secular thinkers have looked for ways to eliminate God from scientific thinking. I'm saying that rather baldly because I want you to understand what this is really about. Secular thinkers, non-Christian thinkers, have looked for ways to do science without thinking about God. If you assume that God is of no significance for anything, whether there is or is not a God is irrelevant to the world, and then begin to do science on that basis, you're going to come up with some rather strange ideas. Among those are evolution and uniformitarianism. Evolution is the idea of progress. All of us are in favor of progress, I hope. Evolution just means change. But Darwinian evolution from the 19th century on is the idea that the species of animals, of living things, arose by natural selection from some original primitive life form. So we begin with something like a bacteria, and that turned into a living creature of some sort that eventually redefined itself into all of the different sorts of life forms that we have on the earth. This idea became popular in the 19th century. Charles Darwin popularized the idea. Darwin didn't invent the idea, he made it popular. He published a book called The Origin of the Species that made everybody really happy because now they had a theory that could compete with the doctrine of creation. Uniformitarianism is an idea that developed in about the same time. As evolution is primarily a biological idea, uniformitarianism is a geological idea. Uniformitarianism says that nothing catastrophic ever happens, that the Earth continues now as it always has, with nothing going on but normal, regular, predictable events. And the fact that every once in a while um, a volcano is going to erupt and change the whole face of the earth all around it should make us think that there's something wrong with that idea. But uniformitarianism is the idea that things have continued now as they have from the beginning of creation, as Peter says. And that has led secular thinkers to adopt what I call the old Earth view of geology. Old Earth meaning either millions, hundreds of millions, or perhaps billions of years. I think the current secular estimate for the age of the universe is about 20 billion years. Now, any way you slice it, that's a long time. The problem, if the secular world were wanting to go that way, I'd be okay with that. It's the least of their problems. The most important problem is that they're going to hell. And going to hell is a bad thing. And believing that the earth is old and evolution happened is just a symptom of that. So if you can get people saved so they're not going to hell, but instead living godly lives, over time you can change the other views, but they're not that important. And I wouldn't worry about it, except that lots of modern Christian thinkers have capitulated to the secular viewpoint. So you'll find a lot of people calling themselves Christians and some of whom I think probably are, some that I respect greatly, who believe in both an old Earth and the evolutionary theory. Now, the problem with that is that they can't both be true. Some of these ideas are binary. That means that they've got to be one or the other. It's like in the modern world, people are supposed to be flexible in their gender. Uh, I've got bad news for people. Um, all of us are either boys or girls. You can't be somewhere in the middle. There is no middle. And the same is true with the secular view and the biblical viewpoint. Either the earth is old or the earth is young. There is no halfway position. As a young earth creationist, I would not be happy with an earth that is merely 5.5 million years old. That wouldn't make me happy at all, because the Bible doesn't teach anything remotely like that. Secondly, either evolution happened or creation happened. There is no such thing as theistic evolution. If God can oversee the evolutionary process because he is so powerful, why could he not just speak the universe into existence as he says he did? If God is good enough to show us all this evidence in the fossil record that the evolutionist thinks he has interpreted, why is God not capable of explaining to us in human language what he has done? So the two cannot really be combined. Either creation is true or evolution is true. Thirdly, either materialism is true or the belief in a supernatural world is true. By material, let's see if I can do something on here. Oops. Ooh, I can have some pointer options and see if I can draw with a pen. This can be kind of fun. I'm going to see if I can do this. I'm going to see if I can draw a little thing. I'm doing this with my mouse, so it's kind of hard. Can you see that? Okay. The materialist, the unhappy guy, believes that everything that exists is a part of the material universe. There is no non-material universe out there. There is no supernatural. The supernaturalist says there is something out there. There is a metaphysic, a beyond the physical. And that metaphysical world is where God lives. So either the world, the universe, is entirely material and all of the processes, all of the events have to be explained in purely material forms, or there is a God who exists outside of the created universe and created it out of nothing. Those are the only two positions. And again, they can't both be true. Finally, either atheism is correct, the idea that there is no God, there never has been a God, or biblical theism is correct. Biblical theism says there is a infinite, perfect, holy, eternal God who exists outside of the created universe and is responsible for that creation. These positions can't both be true. Christians who want to somehow keep their foot in both worlds have got some problems. Okay, I think I've got a way of, let's see if I can do this. Oops, no, oops, oops, Shift Command, oops, oops. Oh well, And now when I shift this, watch this. I'm going to have the same thing happening in the next page. No, it didn't. Okay, let's go to the Grand Canyon. As I said, 7 days walking through or riding a raft through the Grand Canyon. This is one of the best places on the planet to study the origins of the Earth, because it has been sliced by this river through 2 miles of sedimentary rock all the way into the basement rock. And so you can see in this 500-mile long canyon, you can see all of the layers from the modern surface all the way back to the basement rock. If we assume the basement rock is what God created on day one, then we have the entire catalog of the whole history of the Earth in this one place. The other thing that's nice about the Grand Canyon is that it's out in the middle of a desert. And so very little grows out there to get in the way. There are not a lot of trees and grass and goats and whatnot to get in the way of geologists coming and studying this. So I took this trip with 32 other Bible teachers and was accompanied by some guides who were very good with the boats and a team of geologists who are also biblical theologians. And I won't give you their names, but they they spent the week showing us the evidence and teaching us how to examine the evidence and to understand it. Now, we're understanding it from a biblical point of view, but at the same time, we looked at the alternative explanations. And I can tell you, having been here and done that, that the biblical explanation for the Grand Canyon is the only one that makes any sense at all. So this is a good place to go. It's a canyon that could not have been cut by the present Colorado River. The present day Colorado River that runs through the Grand Canyon is not big enough to have cut this canyon. In the present day, there is no significant erosion going on. Every once in a while, a little bit of storm will happen, and particularly the side canyons sometimes see some damage. But the river itself is not big enough to have created this canyon. The Grand Canyon is a part of a much larger formation that covers roughly 1/3 of the surface area of the United States. That's called the Grand Staircase. It goes all the way up into the Rocky Mountains. And there's a full mile of sediment that would be on top of the sediment that we see in the Grand Canyon. At any rate, what we're seeing in the Grand Canyon is this very long series of sedimentary rock. I'll show you a few pictures here. That's one of the boats. And there we are on the river, and we're all moving along and having a wonderful time. And you can see the layers. There's some of the layer way up on the top, and here's a layer under it, and there's the third layer that we call Coconino sandstone, and then underneath that we get into this is a layer of shale, and this is red wall limestone. All of them have different names, and they're different kinds of sedimentary rock until you get all the way down to the bottom. Here we are just starting out. We're going through an area of sandstone just after putting into the river. Here's the group going a little farther into the river. You can see these pontoon boats that we use for running the river. They're actually quite big. They're about 10 meters long, about about 7 meters wide, very good for floating. The Army used these things for building bridges in the war, and now they're available surplus and people can buy them. Yeah, this is a rapid, one of over 110 rapids that we ran during the week. In the background, you can see the limestone. We call it red wall. It's called red wall limestone because there's iron in the sediment, and as it rusts, the rusty color comes up to the surface and runs down the rock. This is the interior of a cave we call the Red Wall Cave. It's very interesting because it's filled with fossils. Just standing in the place where I took this picture, I could probably have reached out and touched 500 different fossils. Interestingly, the fossils that we find in the red wall sandstone are entirely marine fossils. It's all stuff that had lived in the water, but various kinds of things. Some things that still exist, and we find even today in the records, and some things that have been gone for a long time, that have been extinct for years. We saw some other people going down the river. There they are. Yeah, we were suffering for Jesus here. As you can see, this is such an awful experience. Floating down the river. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? I want to show you, first of all, a special kind of limestone, and I'm going, or not limestone, but sandstone. I'm going to draw a line here, add another line here. See how that works? Okay, right there and there. This layer is a Coconino sandstone. It's interesting stuff. This layer is the third layer down from the top of the Grand Canyon. It was deposited by moving water and is full of marine fossils, absolutely stuffed with marine fossils. So it's absolutely clear that this was laid down by moving water. There are three things that are interesting about the Coconino sandstone. The first is the fact that it is found in the North American continent, is found in North Africa, and it's found in the Middle East, all the way into Central Asia. We find this Coconino sandstone all the way into the Himalayas. Way up high on the sides of Mount Everest, they find the Coconino sandstone. The second fact about the Coconino is, as I mentioned before, it's full of marine fossils, fish-type things that lived here. Thirdly, this is something I'll show you some more of in just a second. Let's see if I've got a picture here. Oh, I wonder if I can erase this. See if I can erase this. Okay. Turn up pointer options. I need to make an eraser. Okay, there's one, and there's one. Oh, hey, this is kind of fun. I don't entirely know what I'm doing here, so we're gonna try this. But let's see here. Pointer options. I need a pen. There we go. Okay, you notice something. Oops. Stop it. I wonder if this is really worth all of the effort. But we'll try. I'm going to use a highlighter here because it is kind of easy to work with. Okay, I get a hold of my highlighter. Look at the angle. The Coconino sandstone compared to the rock above, which is a limestone, and the rock below, and you're not going to see it because it's underwater. the Coconino sandstone is cross-bedded. The cross-bedding is not parallel to the underlying or overlying layers. It seems to have been put in place on an angle. And it is clearly made of sand. I'll show you another picture here, and I have to get rid of this. Seems to me there ought to be an easy way to do this. Print options. Ooh, erase pen. Shift E. Ooh, there we go. Okay, you can see that this stuff is made of sand. It's a fairly fine-grained sand, and the critics of Grand Canyon geology, the secular authors, have argued that this is sand dunes. What we know about cross-bedding in sand dunes and in places like this is that in a sand dune, the angle of the cross-bedding is caused by the wind blowing sand up one side and around over the top so that it falls down the downwind side of the dune. That produces a 30 to 32 degree angle in the cross-bedding. Coconino, that we find literally all over the world, has a cross-bedding of from 17 to 25 degrees. It's a shallower angle. When we check other things that are not controversial, like the underwater sand movements that happen during a typhoon, for example, or a hurricane. In the Atlantic Ocean, we call them hurricanes. And some years ago, there was a big hurricane off the coast of Sandy Hook, and there on the East Coast, and a whole bunch of sand was moved underwater, and the cross-bedding that we find is 17 to 20 degrees. It's the same kind of cross-bedding that we find in the Coconino sandstone. This is waterborne sandstone. The second thing that we discover is that these granules of sand have sharp edges. Sand dunes formed in the desert have tiny little particles of sand that look like they've been hit with a hammer. They're made round by bumping along, being driven by the wind. The sand that's moved underwater ends up with sharp angular grains. That's what we find in Coconino. And the third point about this is that it's chock full of fossils, and those are marine fossils, except once in a while we find a fossil that isn't. The layers that we find in the Coconino sandstone could be formed underwater during a hurricane in a matter of hours. There's no reason for this to take millions of years. Matter of fact, we have some evidence that this is a fairly rapid event. Here you see a couple of footprints in an in-between layer of a couple of bits of Coconino sandstone. You can see the tracks, 2 spots, footprints of some small unfortunate animal who got onto this. The water washed away, and this animal perhaps had been swimming. He got up onto the relatively dry sand and began trying to climb away from the water when another wave came by and washed him away. There is an example of what we see in the sandstone. Okay, the upper layers of the limestone are full of fossils. As we go farther down, we're finding different kinds of fossils. The most important thing to recognize about the layers of fossils in the Grand Canyon is that the fossils that we find way up at the top tend to be bigger animals, marine animals in the majority, but we find little guys like this. The Coconino is up toward the top. This little guy could run away from the water as it rose. Once the water took him, he could swim for a while. He could hang on to a piece of wood or something like that. Finally, the violence of it washed him up against something. He tried to run away from the water, but was eventually caught and died. And so we find fossils of these animals way up toward the top. Tiny little animals, microscopic animals, slightly bigger marine animals, we find all the way down at the bottom. There's a layer of sandstone at the very bottom of the Grand Canyon sequence that we call tapetes. And it's a different kind of sandstone. It's a very coarse sandstone, very big granules. But we find this also all over the world. We find it in the Middle East, famously in the Sinai Peninsula. It's layered. It's made up of fairly large grains. It's cross-bedded, 17 to 22 degrees. It's found worldwide. Interestingly, it lies right over the top of a sequence of igneous and sedimentary rocks that are tilted at about a 45-degree angle. And let me see if I can show you this one. I use I use my highlighter to show you this point right here. Oh, there it goes. Here, Shift E. Here it is. See that layer right there? There's a series of, this is actually sedimentary rock underneath and then tapete sandstone over the top. If we were to get real close, we would see the 17-degree cross-bedding in the tapete sandstone. So this isn't cross-bedding. This is layers of sedimentary rock. There's a distinction between the lowest level of the tapete sandstone and the underlying either sedimentary or igneous volcanic rock. And this line right here, the scientists call the great unconformity. For in this layer up here, we find fossils. Lots and lots and lots of fossils. And down here, nothing, no fossils. So they call this level Cambrian and this level Precambrian, and this is the moment of the Cambrian explosion. The scientists will tell us there's 3 billion years missing in that line right there, because all of the evolution that we can't find anywhere else is right there in that little line. Okay, what do we know about the tapete sandstone? It's worldwide, marine fossils, cross-bedding, just like Coconino. It sits right above the great unconformity. Here's a picture of my guide in the Sinai Peninsula in front of some more tapetes sandstone. Some famous inscriptions were written there, and he wanted to show me. There's a shot of the great unconformity in another spot, and there you can see it right there. I'm going to show you some other shots of this. See if I can make that go away. There's that's tapete sandstone, and underneath it is the earlier rock. Here's a close-up. I'm standing about 2 feet away. This is the line right here. It's almost entirely flat. It looks like the sandstone, which is this material, has been laid down over a scoured surface. This is a metamorphic rock that's underneath, contains no fossils at all. Here's millions of fossils right above the great unconformity. As we go along, we went farther and farther into the Grand Canyon until we finally got down to the so-called basement rock, the Vishnu and Shiva formations of the very basement of the earth. These are stones that were laid down during the first day of creation. and then were bent and broken during the third day of creation. And here we see some more of that. As we go farther into the canyon, we start coming up the other side. Here is a little more evidence. You can see here folded rock. See how this line goes? This rock was bent smoothly. The surface that we're looking at here is about 100 feet deep. The entire folded zone in this area is about 400 feet thick and covers multiple layers of sediment. Now, we know that if today you were to lay down a piece of concrete and let it set up for a week or so and then bend it, what you would have would be broken concrete. In order to bend material like this, it would have to be bent fairly quickly after being laid down. This is sedimentary rock that has turned into rock after it was bent. Now, the secular scientists say that this was laid down, each of these tiny little layers, this little black layer and a little white layer and a little gray layer, and each one of those represents millions of years. But if that were true, how did this whole sequence get bent? And yet it was. What the Bible teaches is that the earth was bent, the fountains of the great deep opened, the continents began to drift, the rain came down, the sediment formed and then was bent as the mountains were put in place. This fits that. The secular description of this doesn't fit what we actually see. Here's basalt afterwards. And just one thing to say about the basalt. The secular scientists claim that this is many billions of years old. But this basalt was laid down after the Grand Canyon was formed. It was laid down at the end of the Genesis sequence. There's another batch of basalt at the very basement of the Grand Canyon. If we compare those rocks, we find the same percentages of radioactive elements. They read out to be the same ages. They differ by billions of years depending on what you're specifically reading. But the most recent rock and the most ancient rock, according to the scientists, have exactly the same ages. How can that be? Unless the percentages of radioactive elements in the rocks don't tell us anything about the age, but rather tell us about the composition of the rock. I'm going to suggest a biblical model here for understanding not only the Grand Canyon, but what the Bible actually teaches about the history of the earth. On day one, the creation of everything happened. The basic structure was laid down, basement rocks, the overlying deep ocean, and the movement of that water began doing sedimentation. By creation day 3, the dry land appeared with tremendous motion, a folding and breaking and runoff that would have occurred all over the world, making dry land and mountains and seacoasts and sediments and rivers. This is the in the Grand Canyon, we call this the Grand Canyon sequence. Underneath the Great Unconformity, the basement rocks and all of their sedimentary overburden would have been in place. By the 5th day, let's see here. Okay, by the 5th day, vegetation was thriving. Animals and man appear on the 6th day. All of these were created with an apparent age. The whole universe has an apparent age. After the creation, the fall happened. The curse resulted in death on the earth. So we should, if the earth were billions of years old, we should be finding billions of years of dead things prior to Adam, which is not true. Erosion, sedimentation, a few fossils, but not many, date to this period. The flood then is described, the fall and the curse lead to years of erosion. The flood rises. Water, lava, perhaps ice during this initial period. The flood prevails. The recursion is the sloshing back and forth. Then the flood recedes. As the land goes up, the water runs off doing the erosion. The Grand Canyon would have been cut during the recession phase of the flood, that vast erosion going on. Then after the flood, after the full year-long event, rain, perhaps a vapor canopy, the fountains of the great deep, all of this stuff is happening. And over a long period of time, we find after flood events, the glaciers with lakes dammed up by the glaciers. All over the world, we find evidence of glaciation and the floods that resulted from that. Here in eastern Washington, we have a lot of evidence on the ground of an awful lot of water doing an awful lot of damage on the surface of the ground. And that's been since the flood, in the several hundred years after the flood. Most of the geologic formations on the surface of the earth can be explained in terms of the creation week, the flood year, and the rainbow covenant that has followed on since then. So just a conclusion, biblical scholars don't disagree with the evidence of geology and biology. Our scientists are every bit as smart and every bit as mathematically inclined. We enjoy looking at the evidence and coming to informed conclusions. We don't disagree with the evidence. We disagree with the presuppositions of the non-Christian scientists. When we look at the world from a theistic point of view, we cannot help but believe that there is a God in heaven who created all there is. He cares deeply about the sin that happened. He responded with wrath, and in the midst of it, provided grace. Our story of the creation, of the fall, and the flood are directly related to our belief in salvation by grace through faith. If we don't want to believe the Genesis story, then I have to ask, why would we bother believing in the Gospel of John? For the same ideas are at the core. And that's where I'm going to end today. We're done with about, let's call it chapter 8 of Genesis. We'll get started at the very end of the flood and get into the covenant with Noah and the rest of the lead up to Abraham. We'll probably get into Abraham on Monday, and that's when we'll see you all. So I'm going to